The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Camilla sat in her private study, staring at the newspaper headlines that seemed to mock her from every angle. The royal household had been unusually quiet since dawn, but she could feel the tension building like a storm gathering on the horizon. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, the delicate china rattling against the saucer in a way that betrayed her carefully maintained composure. She had always known this day might come. The whispers in the corridors, the sideways glances from staff members, the way conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room, all signs that something was brewing beneath the surface of palace life. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two entirely different things. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, making even the simplest movements feel labored and difficult. The door to her study opened with a soft creak, and her personal assistant, Margaret, entered with hesitant steps. The older woman's face was pale, her usual warm smile replaced by an expression of barely concealed worry. She carried a silver tray with the morning's correspondence, but her hand shook slightly as she set it down on the mahogany desk. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are some urgent matters that require your attention this morning." The way she said it, with such careful formality, told Camilla everything she needed to know. This wasn't about routine royal business or charitable engagements. This was about something far more serious, something that could potentially shake the very foundations of everything she had worked so hard to build. Camilla nodded slowly, gesturing for Margaret to continue. The assistant's eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on a point just above Camilla's left shoulder. There have been discussions among the senior staff. Some concerns have been raised about certain security protocols and information-sharing procedures within the household. The words hung in the air like smoke, obscuring their true meaning while simultaneously revealing the gravity of the situation. Camilla felt her heart rate increase, a cold dread settling in her stomach. Security protocols and information sharing. These were code words for something much more dangerous. Someone had been talking. Someone with access to sensitive information had decided to break their oath of loyalty and discretion. "What kind of concerns, Margaret?" Camilla's voice remained steady despite the turmoil raging inside her chest. Years of royal training had taught her to maintain her composure even when her world felt like it was crumbling around her. But inside, she was calculating possibilities, running through mental lists of who might have access to damaging information and what their motivations might be. Margaret's discomfort was evident as she shifted from foot to foot, clutching a manila envelope against her chest like a shield. It appears that certain private conversations and internal communications may have been compromised. The head of security has requested an immediate meeting with you and has suggested that Prince William be informed of the situation as well. The mention of William's name sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Camilla's system. Her relationship with her stepson had always been complex, built on layers of history, obligation, and carefully negotiated boundaries. While they maintained a cordial public facade and had developed a working relationship over the years, she knew that his loyalty ultimately lay with his father and the institution of the monarchy itself. If sensitive information had been leaked, and if that information could potentially damage the royal family's reputation, she had no illusions about where William's priorities would fall. "Does William know about this yet?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the way Margaret was avoiding eye contact. The security team felt it was necessary to brief him first, given his position as heir to the throne. Margaret replied carefully. "He's requested a meeting with you this afternoon to discuss the matter." Camilla closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself this brief respite from the mounting pressure. In that darkness behind her eyelids, she could see the careful construction of her new life as it had been built over the past few years. The gradual acceptance by the public, the slow warming of relationships within the family, the The sense that she had finally found her place in this complex and demanding world, all of it now felt precarious, as fragile as spun glass. When she opened her eyes again, Margaret was watching her with a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. The assistant had been with her for nearly a decade, had witnessed her navigate countless challenges and criticisms, had seen her transform from the controversial figure who married the Prince of Wales into someone who genuinely tried to serve the crown with dignity and purpose. If anyone understood the stakes involved in this situation, it was Margaret. "What do we know about the source of the leak?" Camilla asked, her mind already working through damage control scenarios. In the royal household, information was currency, and someone had just spent a considerable amount of it. The question was whether this was an act of malice, desperation, financial motivation, or something else entirely. Margaret finally produced the manila envelope she had been holding, placing it carefully on the desk between them. The investigation is still ongoing, but there are indications that the information came from someone with access to your private quarters and personal communications. Someone who would have been present during confidential conversations. The implications of this statement hit Camilla like a physical blow. Not just anyone had access to her private quarters and personal communications. The circle of people with that level of access was small and carefully vetted. These were people she trusted, people she had allowed into her most personal space, people who had heard her speak candidly about her fears, her frustrations, and her genuine attempts to find her place in a family and institution that had not always welcomed her with open arms. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The thought that someone had been systematically gathering information about her, possibly for weeks or months, made her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that was almost unbearable. "We're not certain yet. The security team is working to establish a timeline, but some of the leaked information appears to date back several months at least." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm, acknowledging the emotional impact of her words while maintaining the professional distance that the situation required. Camilla stood and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the castle grounds. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm. Gardeners tending to the meticulously maintained flower beds, guards conducting their regular patrols, tourists gathering at the gates hoping for a glimpse of royal life. None of them knew that inside these ancient walls, a drama was unfolding that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "What exactly has been compromised?" she asked, still staring out the window. Sometimes it was easier to face difficult truths when you weren't making direct eye contact with the person delivering them. Margaret hesitated, and Camilla could see her reflection in the window as she consulted notes written on a small card. The leaked information includes details about private family discussions, your personal opinions about various royal protocols, and some candid observations about other members of the family. There are also references to your health concerns and some of your private charitable work that hasn't been made public yet. Each item on this list felt like another weight added to Camilla's shoulders. Private family discussions could be interpreted as disloyalty or inappropriately casual attitudes toward royal discretion. Personal opinions about protocols could be seen as resistance to tradition or failure to fully embrace her role. Candid observations about other family members could be twisted into gossip or evidence of a lack of proper respect. Health concerns were nobody's business, but her own and her doctor's, and premature revelation of charitable work could undermine carefully planned announcements and potentially damage relationships with the organizations involved. "And this information has been shared outside the household?" she asked, though she already knew the answer must be yes, or they wouldn't be having this conversation. "We believe it has been provided to at least one media outlet. Our contact in the press are indicating that there may be a story in development, though we don't yet know the timeline for publication or the exact angle they plan to take." The media, of course. Camilla had spent years learning to navigate the complex relationship between the royal family and the British press, understanding that they were simultaneously dependent on each other and locked in a perpetual dance of mutual suspicion. The press needed stories to sell papers and attract viewers, while the royal family needed public support to maintain their relevance and legitimacy. But when that relationship turned adversarial, the consequences could be devastating. She thought about the countless stories that had been written about her over the years, some fair, some wildly inaccurate, some deliberately cruel. She had developed a thick skin about media coverage, understanding that it came with the territory of her position. But this felt different. This wasn't speculation or interpretation of public events. This was intimate information, shared in confidence, now potentially about to be splashed across front pages and dissected by commentators who had no understanding of the context or the genuine human emotions involved. "Has Charles been informed?" she asked, turning back toward Margaret. Her husband's support would be crucial in navigating this crisis, but she also knew that his position as king meant his first loyalty had to be to the institution of the monarchy rather than to her personally. "His Majesty has been briefed by his security team. I understand he's requested a meeting with Prince William before speaking with you directly." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and Camilla felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Charles and William meeting first meant they were discussing strategy, assessing potential damage, and determining the best course of action for the royal family as a whole. While she hoped that course of action would include protecting and supporting her, she couldn't be certain. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by prioritizing its own survival above individual members, and she had no illusions about where she stood in the hierarchy of importance. She walked back to her desk and sat down heavily in the leather chair that had been her sanctuary for so many mornings like this. The familiar surroundings, the photographs of family members, the small personal treasures accumulated over years of marriage to Charles, the books that revealed her interests and passions, all seemed to mock her now with their false sense of security and belonging. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I need you to cancel my appointments for today. All of them. And please ask the kitchen staff to prepare tea for 4 people at 2:30. I have a feeling this afternoon's meeting is going to be longer and more difficult than anyone is anticipating." Margaret nodded and made notes on her ever-present pad. "Is there anything else you need me to do? Any other preparations I should make?" Camilla looked at her loyal assistant, this woman who had stood by her through so many challenges and controversies, and felt a wave of gratitude mixed with deep sadness. "Just be prepared for anything. And, Margaret, whatever happens in the coming days or weeks, I want you to know how much I've appreciated your loyalty and discretion over all these years. You've been more than an assistant. You've been a friend when I needed one most." The older woman's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Your Majesty, it's been an honor to serve you. Whatever challenges lie ahead, we'll face them together." After Margaret left, Camilla sat alone in her study, surrounded by the weight of uncertainty and the echoes of a conversation that had changed everything. She picked up the manila envelope that contained the details of her betrayal and held it in her hands without opening it. Sometimes the anticipation of bad news was easier to bear than the reality of its specific details. Through the windows, she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, darkening the sky and promising rain before the day was through. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor for her current situation, a storm approaching that she could see coming but was powerless to stop. She thought about the person who had leaked this information, trying to imagine what had motivated them to break their oath of confidentiality. Was it money? Had they been offered a sum too large to refuse by a media outlet desperate for inside information? Was it personal animosity? Had she somehow offended or disappointed someone who then decided to exact their revenge through this ultimate betrayal? Or was it something more complex? Perhaps someone who genuinely believed that exposing these private details would somehow serve a greater good? The questions multiplied in her mind without producing any satisfactory answers. In a few hours, she would face William and likely Charles as well, and she would need to be prepared to defend not just her actions, but her right to remain in the position she had worked so hard to earn and maintain. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very human emotions and honest observations that made her relatable to the public could now be used as weapons against her within the family. As the morning wore on, and the storm clouds gathered both outside and within the walls of Windsor Castle, Camilla prepared herself for what might be the most important conversation of her royal life. The leak had been devastating, but her response to it would determine whether she emerged from this crisis stronger or whether it marked the beginning of the end of her carefully constructed place in the royal family. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2:30, its deep resonant tones echoing through the corridors of Windsor Castle like a funeral dirge. Camilla had spent the intervening hours pacing her study, rehearsing possible conversations, and trying to prepare herself for every conceivable outcome. She had changed clothes twice, settling finally on a navy blue dress that projected both authority and humility, a delicate balance that seemed to summarize her entire existence within the royal family. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made her heart rate spike. Multiple sets of footsteps, she realized, which meant this wasn't going to be a simple conversation with William alone. The heavy oak door opened to reveal not just William, but also Charles, looking more formal and distant than she had seen him in years. Behind them walked Sir Edmund Harrington, the head of royal security, carrying a leather briefcase that undoubtedly contained all the damaging details of her personal betrayal. William entered first, his jaw set in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of his late mother during her more determined moments. He had inherited Diana's ability to convey displeasure through subtle body language, and every line of his posture suggested barely contained anger. His usually warm greeting was replaced by a curt nod, and he chose to remain standing rather than taking one of the comfortable chairs she had arranged around the coffee table. Charles followed, his expression unreadable behind the mask of royal composure he had perfected over decades of public life. But Camilla knew him well enough to recognize the signs of internal conflict, the slight tightness around his eyes, the way he held his hands clasped behind his back rather than in his more relaxed usual posture. He was struggling to balance his roles as husband and king, and she could see the strain it was causing him. Sir Edmund closed the door behind them with deliberate care, the soft click sounding unnaturally loud in the tension-filled room. He was a man in his 60s who had spent his entire career protecting royal secrets, and the fact that one of those secrets had been compromised on his watch was clearly weighing heavily on him. His usually perfect posture seemed slightly diminished, as if the weight of professional failure was physically pressing down on his shoulders. "Camilla," Charles said finally, his voice carefully neutral. The use of her name, rather than an endearment, told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking the situation. "I think it's best if we address this matter directly and completely. Sir Edmund has briefed both William and myself on the extent of the security breach." She gestured toward the seating area, hoping to create at least the illusion of a friendly conversation rather than an interrogation. "Please, let's sit down. Would anyone like tea?" William remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. "I think we could dispense with social niceties, Camilla. What we need to understand is how this happened, and what steps we're taking to minimize the damage." The coldness in his voice was like a slap across the face. Over the years, she had worked carefully to build a relationship with William, understanding that he would always prioritize his father's happiness while also protecting his own interests and those of his children. They had found a working equilibrium based on mutual respect and shared commitment to supporting Charles. But now, faced with a crisis that potentially threatened the entire family, that carefully constructed relationship felt as fragile as morning frost. Sir Edmund opened his briefcase and withdrew several files, spreading them across the coffee table with the methodical precision of someone who had delivered bad news many times before. "Your Majesty," he addressed Camilla directly, "I'm afraid the situation is quite serious. We've identified at least 12 separate instances where confidential information from your private communications has been leaked to outside parties." 12 instances. The number hit her like a physical blow, much worse than she had anticipated. This wasn't a single moment of indiscretion or a one-time breach of trust. This was systematic, ongoing betrayal by someone who had regular access to her most private thoughts and conversations. Charles finally sat down, but chose a chair slightly apart from the others rather than the spot beside her on the sofa, where he might normally have positioned himself. The information spans a period of approximately 6 months, he said quietly. It includes details about family discussions, your personal health matters, and your private opinions about various royal protocols and family members. What kind of opinions? William demanded, still standing like a prosecutor addressing a defendant. What exactly did you say that someone felt was worth selling to the press? Camilla felt heat rise in her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and indignation. I'm not sure I understand the implication of that question, William. Are you suggesting that I said something inappropriate? I'm suggesting that if someone in your inner circle felt compelled to betray your confidence, perhaps we should examine what they heard that motivated them to do so. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, toxic and suffocating. William wasn't just questioning her judgment. He was implying that her leaked comments might be so damaging or inappropriate that they justified the betrayal itself. The unfairness of this logic made her hands shake with suppressed anger. Charles held up a hand, his gesture calling for calm. Let's focus on the facts rather than speculation about motivations. Sir Edmund, what exactly has been compromised? The security chief consulted his notes with professional efficiency. The leaked material includes Her Majesty's private observations about the effectiveness of certain royal traditions, her concerns about media coverage and public perception, and some candid discussions about the challenges of adapting to her role within the family. Each item on this list sounded innocuous when described in such clinical terms, but Camilla knew how easily they could be twisted and sensationalized by media outlets looking for controversy. Private observations about royal traditions could be portrayed as resistance to change or failure to respect history. Concerns about media coverage could be characterized as paranoia or oversensitivity. Discussions about challenges adapting to her role could be presented as evidence that she was never truly suited for her position in the first place. There are also references to health concerns and some personal charitable interests that haven't been publicly announced yet, Sir Edmund continued. And perhaps most concerning, there are details about private conversations between Your Majesty and various family members, including discussions about family dynamics and individual personalities. William's expression darkened further. Private conversations about family members? What kind of details? Camilla closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember which conversations might have been overheard and recorded. Over the months, she had confided in various trusted staff members about the complexities of royal family relationships, the challenges of navigating different personalities and expectations, her genuine affection for family members alongside honest assessments of their strengths and weaknesses. These were the kinds of private thoughts that anyone might share with close confidants. But when you were a member of the royal family, such honesty could be weaponized. I may have discussed some of the practical challenges of family gatherings, she said carefully. The logistics of managing different schedules and preferences, the pressure to maintain harmony while respecting individual personalities. Nothing malicious or deliberately harmful, but potentially embarrassing if taken out of context and published in a newspaper. Charles observed, his tone more sad than accusatory. Sir Edmund cleared his throat diplomatically. I'm afraid there are also references to Your Majesty's private thoughts about public duties and royal engagements. Comments about which events you find meaningful versus those you consider merely obligatory. This revelation made William's face flush with anger. You've been complaining about royal duties to your staff? Discussing which engagements you don't want to attend. I've been human, Camilla shot back, her own composure finally cracking under the weight of sustained criticism. I've shared honest thoughts about the demands of this role with people I trusted. I've talked about finding meaning in my work while acknowledging that some aspects are more challenging than others. If that's a crime, then Every member of this family is guilty of it. The difference, Williams said coldly, is that the rest of us understand the importance of absolute discretion. We don't confide our private doubts and criticisms to staff members who might be tempted to sell our secrets to the highest bidder. The cruelty of this statement took her breath away. William was essentially arguing that she had brought this betrayal upon herself through her own poor judgment and inappropriate familiarity with household staff. He was suggesting that her attempts to build genuine human relationships within the formal structure of royal life had been naive and dangerous. Charles stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to the room. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. The question now is how we manage this situation going forward. The press has this information, and they're likely to publish some version of it regardless of our preferences. What are our options? Camilla asked, though she suspected the answer wouldn't provide much comfort. Sir Edmund consulted another file from his briefcase. We have 3 primary approaches available. First, we can attempt to negotiate with a media outlet to limit the scope and tone of their coverage. Second, we can proactively address the situation by releasing our own statement that frames the leaked information in context. Third, we can simply weather the storm and respond to coverage as it appears. What's your professional recommendation? Charles asked without turning from the window. Honestly, Your Majesty, each approach has significant risks. Negotiating with the press might be seen as an admission of wrongdoing and could encourage them to demand more concessions. Proactive statements might give the story more attention than it would otherwise receive. And simply waiting for publication leaves us reactive rather than controlling the narrative. William finally sat down, though his posture remained rigid and unwelcoming. There's another option we haven't discussed. Camilla could consider temporarily stepping back from public duties until this situation resolved itself. The suggestion hit the room like a thunderbolt. Stepping back from public duties was essentially exile from royal life, an admission of serious wrongdoing that would be impossible to recover from completely. It was the nuclear option, reserved for family members who had committed genuinely serious breaches of protocol or brought significant scandal upon the institution. You can't be serious, Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're suggesting I go into hiding because someone betrayed my trust? I'm suggesting we consider all available options for protecting the institution, William replied with chilling formality. Your personal feelings, while understandable, cannot be our primary consideration. Charles turned from the window, his face pale but determined. That's enough, William. Camilla is my wife and a member of this family. She's not going anywhere. The tension between father and son was suddenly palpable. 2 generations of royal duty clashing over fundamentally different approaches to crisis management. William represented the modern monarchy's emphasis on public relations and image control, while Charles embodied an older tradition of family loyalty and institutional stability through continuity. Father, William said carefully, I understand your personal feelings about this situation, but as your heir, I have a responsibility to think about the long-term implications of our decisions. If this story damages public confidence in the monarchy, the consequences will last long after this particular crisis has passed. And if we abandon family members at the first sign of difficulty, what does that say about the values we claim to represent? Charles countered. Camilla has served this institution faithfully for years. She doesn't deserve to be punished for someone else's betrayal. Sir Edmund looked increasingly uncomfortable as the family conflict played out in front of him. Perhaps, he said diplomatically, we could focus on identifying the source of the leak before making decisions about public response strategies. What progress has been made on that front? Camilla asked, grateful for anything that might shift attention away from her own future within the family. We've narrowed the possibilities to a small group of individuals with regular access to your private quarters and communications, Sir Edmund replied. We're conducting discreet interviews and reviewing security footage from the relevant time periods. How long will that take? Charles asked. We should have a definitive answer within 48 hours at most. William stood again, his impatience evident. That's too long. The press isn't going to wait for our internal investigation to conclude before they publish their story. Then what do you suggest? Camilla asked, though she was beginning to suspect she might not like his answer. I suggest we prepare for the worst-case scenario, he replied. We develop response strategies for the most damaging possible interpretation of the leaked information, and we consider all available options for minimizing harm to the institution. Including my exile, she said bitterly. Including all available options, he repeated firmly. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the room, Camilla realized that her world had fundamentally changed in the space of a few hours. The security of her position, which she had thought was finally established after years of careful work and gradual acceptance, was now entirely dependent on factors beyond her control. The media's interpretation of her leaked words, the public's reaction to those interpretations, and William's assessment of the damage to the monarchy would all play a role in determining whether she had a future within the royal family. The meeting ended without resolution, with agreement only that they would reconvene once the source of the leak had been identified. As the men filed out of her study, Charles paused at the door and looked back at her with an expression that combined love, regret, and something that might have been an apology for the impossible situation they all found themselves in. Alone again in her study, Camilla sat among the scattered security files that detailed her betrayal and wondered whether this was how it would end, not with any great scandal or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, systematic destruction of trust and the careful calculations of institutional damage control. The storm outside had begun in earnest, rain lashing against the windows with increasing intensity, and she couldn't help but wonder whether she would still be living in this room when the weather finally cleared. The next 24 hours passed with agonizing slowness, each minute weighted with uncertainty and the constant fear of devastating news. Camilla found herself unable to concentrate on anything beyond the immediate crisis, her usual routines disrupted by the knowledge that her entire future hung in the balance of an ongoing investigation. She canceled all her public engagements, citing a minor illness, while behind the scenes the royal security team worked frantically to identify the source of the betrayal. Margaret had been her constant companion during this period, bringing meals that went largely untouched and providing updates on the investigation's progress. The loyal assistant had also taken on the delicate task of managing communications with the outside world, fielding calls from various royal offices and charity organizations while maintaining the fiction that everything was proceeding normally. The security team has completed their interviews with the primary suspects, Margaret reported during their morning briefing. Her voice carried a note of cautious optimism, but her expression remained carefully neutral. Sir Edmund believes they've identified the individual responsible for the leak. Camilla set down her untouched cup of coffee and looked up sharply. Who? Thomas Whitmore, one of the junior valets who's been with your household for approximately 8 months. Margaret consulted her notes carefully. He had access to your private quarters during the relevant time periods and has been experiencing significant financial difficulties due to his mother's medical expenses. The name hit Camilla like a physical blow. Thomas was a young man in his mid-20s whom she had personally recommended for promotion after noticing his dedication and attention to detail. She had known about his mother's illness and had even quietly arranged for additional financial support through the royal household's discretionary fund. The idea that someone she had tried to help had systematically betrayed her trust felt like the cruelest possible twist to an already devastating situation. Are they certain? She asked, though part of her didn't want to hear the confirmation. The evidence is quite compelling. Security cameras show him in your study during times when he shouldn't have been there, and phone records indicate regular contact with a journalist known for paying sources for inside information about the royal family. Margaret's voice softened with sympathy. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I know you had taken a personal interest in his welfare. Camilla closed her eyes and tried to process this information objectively, but the emotional impact was overwhelming. She had prided herself on treating the household staff with dignity and respect on being approachable and genuinely interested in their lives and challenges. The discovery that this approach had been exploited by someone she had tried to help felt like a fundamental rejection of everything she had attempted to accomplish in her role. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Sir Edmund is coordinating with the police regarding potential criminal charges for breach of confidence and theft of private information. Thomas has been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, and his access to all royal properties has been revoked." The mention of criminal charges introduced another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. While Camilla wanted justice for the betrayal, she also understood that a public trial would inevitably bring more attention to the leaked information and potentially expose even more details about her private life. The cure might prove worse than the disease. Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the study door. Margaret opened it to reveal Sir Edmund himself, looking grim but determined. Behind him stood William, his expression unreadable, but his presence suggesting that whatever news the security chief brought would have immediate implications for family dynamics. "Your Majesty," Sir Edmund began without preamble, "we need to discuss our options regarding Thomas Whitmore and the information he provided to the press." "Has he confessed?" Camilla asked. "He has, and he's provided details about the scope of information he shared and the financial arrangements he made with his media contact." Sir Edmund placed a new file on the coffee table. "I'm afraid the situation is more extensive than we initially believed." William stepped forward, his jaw set in that familiar expression of controlled anger. Thomas didn't just sell information about private conversations. He had been systematically photographing documents, recording conversations on his phone, and even copying private correspondence. The revelation that her betrayal had been so thorough and premeditated made Camilla feel physically sick. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single poor decision driven by desperation. This was calculated espionage conducted by someone she had trusted and tried to help. The violation felt almost unbearably personal. "How much did he receive for this information?" she asked, though she wasn't sure why the financial details mattered to her. £25,000 initial payment, with promises of additional compensation based on the impact of published stories, Sir Edmund replied. He was essentially being paid as a long-term asset rather than for a single transaction. The amount was substantial enough to explain the motivation while being small enough to highlight the cheapness of her betrayal. £25,000 to destroy years of careful relationship building and institutional trust. £25,000 to potentially end her career as a working member of the royal family. The media outlet involved is preparing a multi-part series based on his information, William continued. They're planning to release stories over several weeks, each focusing on different aspects of what they're calling the real Camilla behind palace walls. The phrase made her wince. She knew exactly how such a series would be structured. Each installment designed to maximize controversy and sales, her words taken out of context, and presented in the most damaging possible light. Her honest discussions about the challenges of royal life would become evidence of her unsuitability for the role. Her private concerns about family dynamics would be portrayed as disloyalty and ingratitude. Her human moments of doubt and frustration would be transformed into proof that she had never truly embraced her position. "When is the first story published?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," Sir Edmund replied. The headline is apparently Queen Camilla's Secret Doubts. Palace Insider reveals royals' true feelings about family and duty. The room fell silent as the implications of this timeline sank in. Tomorrow morning, millions of people would wake up to read intimate details about her private thoughts and conversations. By noon, every news program and social media platform would be analyzing and debating her leaked words. By evening, her entire public persona could be irreparably damaged. "What are our options at this point?" she asked, though she suspected the window for meaningful intervention had already closed. William sat down across from her, his posture suggesting a difficult conversation was about to begin. "We have very limited options for preventing publication," but we do have some control over how we respond to it. The palace communications team has prepared several potential statements, Sir Edmund added. We can express regret about the breach of privacy while defending your right to private conversations. We can emphasize the criminal nature of Thomas's actions while minimizing discussion of the actual content. Or we can proactively address specific leaked information by providing context and explanation. Each option sounded inadequate to address the scale of the problem they were facing. Defending her right to private conversations might seem reasonable in principle, but would likely be overshadowed by the specific content of those conversations. Emphasizing the criminal nature of a leak might divert some attention from the substance, but would also reinforce the impression that there was something damaging to hide. Providing context for leaked information would give her more control over the narrative, but might also amplify stories that would otherwise receive less attention. There's another consideration we need to discuss, Williams said carefully. The impact this will have on public confidence in the monarchy more generally. Camilla looked at her stepson with growing apprehension. What kind of impact? Polling data suggests that public support for the monarchy is closely tied to perceptions of family unity and shared values. If this story portrays you as someone who privately criticizes royal traditions or speaks negatively about other family members, it could undermine broader public confidence in the institution. The implication was clear, though William was too diplomatic to state it directly. Her personal crisis had the potential to damage not just her own position, but the monarchy itself. And if forced to choose between protecting her and protecting the institution, the family would always choose the institution. Are you asking me to consider stepping down? She asked directly, wanting to force the conversation into the open rather than dancing around its central question. William exchanged glances with Sir Edmund before responding. We're asking you to consider what would be best for everyone involved, including yourself. A temporary withdrawal from public duties might allow this situation to resolve itself with minimal long-term damage. And if I refuse, then we support you publicly while working behind the scenes to minimize the damage, he replied. But I want you to understand that the cost could be significant, both personally and institutionally. Charles chose that moment to enter the study, his arrival changing the dynamic of the conversation immediately. He looked exhausted, as if he had spent a sleepless night wrestling with impossible decisions, and his usual dignified bearing seemed diminished by the weight of his competing loyalties. I've been briefed on Thomas's confession and the publication timeline, he said without preamble. I've also spoken with the Prime Minister about potential political implications and with the Archbishop of Canterbury about moral and ethical considerations. The mention of these consultations revealed how seriously the situation was being taken at the highest levels of British society. When family matters required discussions with political and religious leaders, it meant the crisis had moved far beyond personal or even institutional concerns into questions of national stability and public confidence. What do they advise? Camilla asked, though she was beginning to suspect she might not like the answer. Charles sat down beside her for the first time since the crisis began, a gesture that provided some comfort, even as his words confirmed her worst fears. They both emphasized the importance of protecting the institution while treating all family members with dignity and respect. They also both suggested that temporary measures might be preferable to permanent damage. Temporary measures, she repeated. You mean exile? I mean a strategic withdrawal that allows time for public attention to move on to other matters, he replied gently. A few months away from public duties, perhaps some charitable work abroad, until this situation has run its course. The pain of this suggestion, coming from her husband, was almost unbearable. Charles was essentially asking her to sacrifice her position and her carefully built life for the sake of institutional stability. He was choosing his role as king over his role as husband, duty over personal loyalty, the monarchy's survival over her happiness. And if I agree to this temporary withdrawal, she said slowly, what guarantee do I have that it will actually be temporary? The silence that greeted this question told her everything she needed to know. There were no guarantees. Once she stepped away from her royal duties under circumstances like these, there was no guarantee she would ever be allowed to resume them. She would be dependent on the family's assessment of public opinion and their judgment about when or whether her return would be acceptable to the British people. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "I need to consider my options and what I'm willing to sacrifice for the sake of institutional stability." "Of course," Charles replied, though his tone suggested time was a luxury they might not have. "But I want you to know that whatever you decide, you'll always be my wife and a member of this family. This crisis doesn't change the fundamental reality of our relationship." As the others filed out of her study, leaving her alone with her impossible choices, Camilla wondered whether Charles truly believed those words or whether he was simply trying to ease his own conscience about the decision he was asking her to make. The storm outside had intensified during their conversation, and the sound of rain against the windows seemed to echo her own internal turbulence. In less than 18 hours, her private words would become public knowledge, and everything she had worked to build during her years as a member of the royal family would be subjected to unprecedented scrutiny. The question now was whether she would face that scrutiny from her position as a working royal, with all the resources and support that position provided, or whether she would face it in exile, dependent on the family's willingness to eventually welcome her back from whatever distant corner of the world they deemed appropriate for her rehabilitation. The choice, such as it was, lay entirely in her hands. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Windsor Castle, the pale morning light filtering through heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the weight pressing down on Camilla's chest. She had spent the entire night walking through the corridors of her wing of the castle, her mind churning through possibilities and consequences, searching for a path that didn't require sacrificing either her dignity or her place in the royal family. The morning newspapers had already hit the streets, and Margaret brought the first editions to her study with trembling hands. The headlines were as devastating as anticipated, perhaps even worse. "Camilla's secret recordings reveal royal family chaos," screamed the front page of one tabloid, accompanied by a photograph of her at a recent charity event with a caption questioning whether her smile had been genuine. The story inside was a masterclass in selective quotation and context manipulation. Her private concerns about adapting to royal protocols were presented as evidence of resistance and disloyalty. Her honest observations about family dynamics were twisted into gossip and character assassination. Her moments of vulnerability and uncertainty, shared in confidence with trusted staff members, were transformed into proof that she had never been suited for her position. But perhaps most painful was the way the story portrayed her relationship with the staff member she had tried to treat with warmth and respect. The article suggested that her informality and personal interest in their lives was inappropriate boundary crossing that had inevitably led to this betrayal. In attempting to be human and approachable, she was now being accused of poor judgment and unprofessional conduct. "The other newspapers are taking similar approaches," Margaret reported quietly. "Some are focusing more on the security implications, others on what they're calling revelations about family relationships. But the overall tone is quite critical." Camilla set the papers aside without reading further. She had seen enough to understand the scope of the damage and the likely trajectory of public reaction. Social media would amplify and distort these stories throughout the day. Television news programs would invite experts to analyze her fitness for royal duties. Opinion polls would measure declining public confidence in her position. By evening, the consensus narrative would be that she had brought this crisis upon herself through inappropriate behavior and poor judgment. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Charles entered without waiting for permission, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. He was already dressed for his day of official engagements, but his usually perfect appearance seemed somehow diminished, as if the weight of recent decisions had physically aged him overnight. "I've been on the phone with Downing Street," he said without preamble. The Prime Minister is concerned about the political implications if this story continues to dominate news cycles. There are questions in Parliament about royal household security and accountability. The involvement of political authorities added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. When a monarchy became a source of political controversy, it threatened the carefully maintained constitutional balance that allowed the royal family to continue existing in a democratic society. Charles was essentially telling her that her personal crisis had become a matter of national concern. "What kind of questions?" she asked, though she suspected the answers would only make her feel worse. Questions about whether appropriate vetting procedures exist for household staff, whether family members understand their responsibilities regarding confidential information, and whether the current structure provides adequate protection for sensitive communications. Charles sat down heavily in the chair across from her. In essence, they're questioning whether the royal household is capable of protecting state secrets if it can't protect private conversations. The implications of this line of inquiry were staggering. If Parliament began to question the royal family's competence in handling sensitive information, it could lead to external oversight, reduced independence, and fundamentally altered relationships with government institutions. Her personal betrayal was threatening to become a constitutional crisis. "And their recommendation?" she asked, though she had already guessed the answer. "They've strongly suggested that we take decisive action to demonstrate accountability and restore confidence. They haven't explicitly demanded your withdrawal, but they've made it clear that continued controversy would be politically problematic for everyone involved." Charles was delivering the final blow to her position, though he was doing it with a diplomatic language that allowed everyone to maintain the fiction that this was her choice rather than an ultimatum. The government had effectively decided that she was more trouble than she was worth, and Charles was being forced to choose between supporting his wife and maintaining his relationship with the political authorities who enabled his reign. Before she could respond, William entered the study with an urgency that suggested new developments. He carried several phones and tablets, clear signs that he had been monitoring media coverage and public reaction throughout the morning. "The story is spreading faster than we anticipated," he announced without greeting either of them. "Social media engagement is massive, and international outlets are picking up the coverage. This isn't just a British story anymore. It's global news about dysfunction within the royal family." Camilla felt the walls closing in around her as the scope of her crisis expanded beyond anything she had imagined possible. What had begun as a betrayal by one staff member had mushroomed into an international incident that threatened to undermine decades of careful image management and diplomatic relationship building. "What's the tone of international coverage?" Charles asked. "Mixed, but concerning," William replied, consulting his tablet. "Some outlets are focusing on the security implications and expressing sympathy for the breach of privacy. Others are treating this as confirmation of long-standing rumors about family tensions and your fitness for the role," he said, addressing Camilla directly. "And the public reaction?" Polling data shows a significant drop in approval ratings, both for Camilla personally and for the royal family generally. More concerning is the demographic breakdown. We're seeing particularly sharp declines among younger voters who are already skeptical about the monarchy's relevance. The mention of declining support among younger demographics struck at the heart of the royal family's long-term survival strategy. The monarchy's future depended on maintaining sufficient public support to justify its continued existence, and young people's attitudes would determine whether that support existed in 20 or 30 years. If her crisis accelerated existing trends toward Republican sentiment, the consequences could extend far beyond her personal position. Sir Edmund appeared in the doorway, having arrived with new information that apparently couldn't wait for scheduled briefings. "Your Majesties," he said formally, "I'm afraid there's been another development. Thomas Whitmore has given a television interview that's scheduled to air this evening." The room fell silent as the implications of this news sank in. A television interview would humanize Thomas, give him an opportunity to justify his betrayal, and potentially reveal additional damaging information that hadn't yet been published. It would also ensure that the story remained in headlines for at least another news cycle, prolonging the damage and making resolution even more difficult. "What's the content of the interview?" Charles asked. "We don't have complete details, but our contacts at the network suggest he discusses his motivations, provides additional context for some of the leaked information, and makes claims about the working conditions and treatment of staff within the royal household." Camilla felt a chill run down her spine. Claims about staff treatment could open entirely new avenues for criticism and investigation. If Thomas portrayed himself as a victim of an unfair or exploitative employment situation, it could shift public sympathy toward him and away from the royal family. It could also prompt other current or former staff members to come forward with their own stories, creating an avalanche of negative coverage that would be impossible to manage. "Is there any way to prevent the interview from airing?" William asked. "We've explored legal options, but since Thomas is speaking about his own experiences and the information has already been made public through the newspaper stories, there are limited grounds for intervention," Sir Edmund replied. Charles stood and walked to the window, his back to the room, as he wrestled with decisions that would affect everyone present. When he finally turned around, his expression had hardened into the mask of royal determination that Camilla had seen him wear during other crises, though never one that struck so close to the heart of their personal relationship. "Camilla," he said gently but firmly, "I think we need to seriously consider a temporary withdrawal from public duties. Not as an admission of wrongdoing, but as a way to allow the situation to stabilize while we work on longer-term solutions." The word she had been dreading finally hung in the air between them. No longer suggestions or possibilities, but actual requests from the man who was both her husband and her sovereign. Charles was asking her to sacrifice her position for the sake of institutional stability, and the pain of that request was almost unbearable. "For how long?" she asked quietly. "Until we can be confident that your return wouldn't reignite controversy," he replied. "Until the public has had time to process this situation and move on to other concerns." "That could be months or years," she pointed out. "And there's no guarantee that time away would actually solve anything. I could be in exile indefinitely." "It's a risk," William admitted. "But it's a smaller risk than continuing to weather criticism that shows no signs of diminishing." Camilla looked around the study that had been her sanctuary for so many years, at the personal photographs and mementos that represented her journey from controversial figure to accepted family member. Everything she had worked to build was now threatened by forces beyond her control, and her only options were to fight a battle she was likely to lose or surrender gracefully and hope for eventual rehabilitation. "I need one more day," she said finally. 24 hours to consider my decision and put my affairs in order." Charles nodded, though his expression suggested he hoped her consideration would lead to the conclusion he was seeking. "Of course. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, it doesn't change our relationship or my feelings about you personally." After everyone had left, Camilla sat alone in her study as afternoon shadows lengthened across the room. Outside, life continued its normal rhythm. Gardeners working in the flower beds, guards conducting their patrols, tourists gathering at the castle gates. None of them knew that inside these walls, decisions were being made that would reshape one woman's life and potentially alter the trajectory of an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years. The leaked information had been devastating, but it was the reaction to that information that would ultimately determine her fate. In 24 hours, she would need to choose between fighting for her position from an increasingly weakened stance or accepting exile with the hope of eventual return. Either choice would require sacrifices she wasn't sure she was prepared to make, but the luxury of avoiding difficult decisions was no longer available to her. As evening approached and the first television previews of Thomas's interview began appearing on news programs, Camilla realized that tomorrow's decision would define not just her immediate future, but her entire legacy within the royal family. The question was whether she was prepared to go down fighting or whether discretion truly Was the better part of valor in a battle where the odds were so heavily stacked against her?